The 2025 salary cap is not yet finalized, but the league did give some good news to its 32 teams, and it is especially good news for the Miami Dolphins. We're looking at why here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special shout out and welcome to our everydayers because it is your team. Every day we don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, according to ESPN's Dan Graziano, 19 hours ago, we got a big update as it pertains to a big domino for this offseason for really how far the Dolphins can go in some of the personnel moves that this team needs to make. Dan Graziano, 19 hours ago. The NFL Today, a.k.a. yesterday, informed teams that the 2025 per-team salary cap will fall in the range of $277.5 to $281.5 million, way up from last year's $255.4 million cap. Cap will have increased by more than $53 million over the last two seasons. As the kids say, business is booming in the NFL. And there's the NFL and the NFLPA is still negotiating some fine print as far as determining where this final number in between those two figures is going to check in at. But what's really most important to note is almost anywhere you looked, projections were $272.5 to $275 million. This is $5 to $9 million, depending on what resource you looked at and what new projection you're going to choose to use, above the previous expected total that teams were going to have to work with. And that's before you get into things like rollover cap for teams that roll over additional cap space that they didn't use this year, because it's not like other things. If you don't use it, you don't lose it. You can bring it with you to the next year. So all that's part of the league's aspiration for parity and the league's tools that they give teams to incentivize and encourage everybody to continue to spend dollars, right? So that's where we're at with this projection. This number usually comes out the week of the combine. I would expect 8 days from now, at the latest, we'll know what the league's official tally is, and they will have finished their negotiation with the NFLPA over some additional that they wanted to smooth out. Instead of having like a 1 year massive spike, they wanted to have it to partition out over multiple years, so it was a more incremental and gradual increase, so it was better for more rounds of players that are going into the market and testing free agency and needing new contracts, which is smart. The question is just now, how much are they going to exhaust of that kind of surplus that is intended to be stretched out over multiple years? How much are they going to use of it this year? Selfishly, as a guy who's covering the Dolphins, rooting for the Dolphins, loves the Dolphins, empty the chamber. Give us 281.5, please. Because what I can tell you is this. We're going to get into what some of this kind of stuff means for Miami now. I had the Dolphins in my own personal bookkeeping because, again, depending on where you choose to look, whether it's over the cap or the NFLPA figure, which is not updated for 2025, but they put out a daily team cap report, and you could use that to cross-reference in 2024 and kind of figure out what the right numbers are and the wrong numbers are, because that's official through the NFLPA or Spot Track. There's a bunch of different resources that you can use. But the bookkeeping that I have the Dolphins at, and I do keep it myself, and I tell you guys I'm not a math guy, and I do hate to come straight out and tell you guys as my platform and the community that we've grown here together on Locked On Dolphins that I lie to you, but I do kind of lie to you, right? Like, we don't do all this stuff without knowing how to do a little bit of math. So My numbers had the Dolphins in salary cap commitments right now at $279.5 million. So you could say, okay, it's 279.5 and change, right? There's an extra $28,070 in my personal books. But for the sake of round numbers, 279.5. And the report from Dan Graziano has you at 277.5 to 281.5. So Miami's cap commitments are right in the middle of that. But this is where those tools come into play. The Dolphins did not use all of their salary cap from 2024. As a matter of fact, they've already committed what they're rolling over into this year from last year's cap pool. It's $3 million. It's like $3,001,000 that they rolled over in cap space. 3.001 million is what they rolled over. So even if the floor of the new projection, if it comes in as low as it's going to come, 277.5, you have to add $3 million to that because that's the Dolphins' personal team cap from the league-wide floor plus their rollover cap from last year, which means they have 280.5 is their minimum cap space, the team's minimum cap space, which means, as things currently stand, this football team is salary cap compliant with having trimmed 3 names off the roster. Raheem Mostert, Durham Smythe, and Kendall Fuller. So at worst case scenario right now, with the new league projections, with the books being close to accurate, depending on where you look, there's a couple $100,000 difference up or down. The Dolphins are salary cap compliant for 2025 before they've really begun their work to really get salary cap compliant. And that's, of course, assuming the worst case scenario with the lowest of the possible projections that you got. So we're going to get a little bit more into what all this means for Miami next year on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back this year, and then waiting and wondering and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back, guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with the TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right. So, this goes without saying, if the league chooses to exhaust and empty the chamber, you're talking about the Dolphins being at 281.5 plus their $3 million in rollover cap. That means the team's individual cap for the year would be 284.5. And that would put the Dolphins at about $5 million in cap space to start with before they make any additional moves. And I'll give you a spoiler alert. I think there's more than a half dozen contracts that this team should just do basic restructures with, nothing crazy with, not adding a bunch of new void years or anything like that. But guys with base salaries that are healthy dollar amounts. If you use the over-the-cap tool, they have a cap calculator, which is very helpful for this kind of stuff. But some of it gets more muddy when you're looking at like post-June 1st or like, is a player bonus guaranteed as a certain date? But if you move on from a player, you don't pay it, then it's not accelerating a bunch of extra cap hit. Like it gets messy. But I can look at the table and I can see, okay, Bradley Chubb has a $19.45 million salary. You could choose to restructure some of that money. Tua Tagovailoa has a $25,046,000 base salary this year. You could choose to restructure some of that and prorate that out. Those are the contracts I would not touch, by the way, is the big four right now. I want to focus on everything the Dolphins can do without the big four contracts, and Tagovailoa, Chubb, Hill, and Armstead, because I think there's some long-term questions with the Tua contract that I don't want to continue to defer money to have more long-term flexibility. Chubb, Armstead, there's ramps. We've exhausted some of those conversations, but just pointing out that those are contracts that have larger lump sum dollar amounts. But Austin Jackson, base salary is about $11 million. Zach Sealer, Jordan Brooks, it's between $7.5 and $8 million for each one of those guys. Aaron Brewer at $6.5. Jason Sanders, $4 million salary. Jonnu Smith, $3.5 million salary. You can touch a lot of these contracts and just do basic restructures, and it's going to give the Dolphins a pretty healthy and competitive operating cap for the start of this process, regardless of what you choose to have happen with Terron Armstead and Bradley Chubb. But I want to put like the change in forecast in perspective, because if you looked at 272.5 versus 277.5 is now the new floor for what cap projections are. That $5 million difference, you might say, that's okay. No, it's a pretty decent $5 million is $5 million. But to put it properly in perspective, the difference in what just the cap forecast is looking at, like $9 million, if you did the big number, if you went from 272 to 281, and that $9 million discrepancy, that's almost twice as much money as the Dolphins could save up front if they moved on pre-June 1st from both Bradley Chubb and Terron Armstead combined. That dollar amount is about $5.5 million, $5.55 million or so in cap space. So it's not, I'm good enough math guy to know that double that is $11 million. So I know it's not exactly double. But that's a huge deal to have that much extra operating cap. And then you consider, you signed Aaron Brewer last year, and as an example of a player that you signed to a big, a second contract that's not a small deal. Well, it wasn't a break the bank type of contract, but his cap number, he signed a 3-year deal at $21 million was the total value. The year one cap for that was $2.5 million. You could fit almost 4 Aaron Brewer sized contracts in just the difference of what the forecasted floor of the cap was versus the new ceiling is of the new cap forecast. If that discrepancy ends up being $9 million, you're talking 3 contracts valued at 3 years, $21 million, or a bigger contract. And I'm not saying, hey, go out and spend all your money in free agency and exhaust this and exhaust that. And you still got to be smart. You still got to be selective. But the flexibility that this now gives you with this discrepancy of just, hey, the spending ceiling was going to be here, and now the spending ceiling's here. That difference alone is enough for a large-sized contract, or alternatively, multiple middle-class contracts that you can add to this roster. And the question is, which of your upper-class contracts are you going to keep? And which one of your middle-class, and how many more middle-class contracts do you feel you need to fill out a deep and competitive roster? And that's the perpetual level of unknown that is, really difficult to thread the needle with, because there is a whole debate around a bunch of teams about the merits of paying for depth versus paying for, stars and scrubs versus paying for a well-balanced roster. And more often than not, the way you get the well-balanced roster is you have to pay everybody. And I don't know that that's a world that the Dolphins should be living in with who they have chosen to pay over the last couple of years and the salary cap dominoes off of that. But we just got done talking about, and this gets a little bit more into long-term effects as well, but we just looked at the hypothetical about a week and a half ago of if the Dolphins were to move on from all of the big 3 players, right? Bradley Chubb, he didn't play for you last year. You had to get acclimated to playing without him. If you choose to move on and take your bad medicine in that regard, that was the show. If you missed it, is the Dolphins should take some bad medicine. You would save $1.25 million this year against the cap if you moved on straight away as a not post-June 1st designation. But then you would, in turn, open up $29 million in cap space in 2026. For Tyreek Hill, if you took your bad medicine, you'd lose $500,000 against the cap if you traded him pre-June 1st and got whatever you could before the draft. But then you'd free up $52 million in cap space in 2026. And for Terron Armstead, you could say $4.25 million if you moved on or if he retired and you processed it pre-June 1st. But then you'd open up, what, 20 is, let me get the number right here, $22.1 million in cap space in 2026. But you're talking about $100 million in 2026 cap space if you took your bad medicine with those players. If you choose to do that now, knowing that the savings moving on from all three of those players is about $5 million, you tack potentially $9 million onto your forecast on top of that. Now you're saving 13. Like it opens up so much more. And I think that's why you have seen the Dolphins kind of make this. They did some trimming of the fat for guys that it was very apparent at the end of the year, weren't going to be long-term pieces of the puzzle. And there was immediate cap savings for not a lot of dead cap in a Raheem Mostert where you took $1 million in dead cap, but saved $3 million. And Durham Smythe, you split about 50-50, saved $2.25 and took $2.5 in dead cap. And Kendall Fuller was obviously the big one. That was a little bit of a surprise to everybody. So I don't think they made those moves with the intent of like, all right, let's get ourselves salary cap compliant and then figure out what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. But I do think these are low-hanging fruit moves to make to trim some fat off the roster. And now that we've got a forecast that's higher than what was expected, it kind of forces you to reassess. I know for me, in preparation of doing like the offseason blueprint, I've probably done 5 or 6 simulated like full off seasons, internal free agencies, restructures, additional roster cuts, external free agency, simulated mock drafts. And I'm trying not to trade for a bunch of extra picks, even though I think that's the right thing for the team to do. Get to a 53-man roster projection. And is there anybody you're designated post June 1st out of that? Because you need cap space in June to be able to sign your draft class. Well, this additional wiggle room as far as the new cap floor changes the dynamic of being able to sign your draft class. So you could probably sign your whole draft class and then be able to accommodate the practice squad figure for close to about the dollar amount in extra cap space you're getting here. So it's just, where do you want to budget the new space? Do you want to do it on the front end to add more to the roster and still have a domino that's a lever you pull that you get cash in the summertime to be able to sign your draft class? And there's a big domino you could pull there with Bradley Chubb. And in that process, you would save, $18.5 million in the process. So these are all the questions the Dolphins are now asking themselves. And that's what this means for Miami, is everybody's kind of back to the drawing board as far as what's the best strategy now that there is a significant increase in the projected spending floor. Some long-term effects here at play as well. We're going to get into that next here on Locked On Dolphins, so stick with us. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off, or if you want to bet on a big fourth quarter rally, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for bigger payouts, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment exciting throughout the game. Whether you're backing that late game comeback or you're picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you never miss your chance on FanDuel. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the long-term piece here that does get interesting is it is very difficult to forecast year over year now where the salary cap ceiling is going to come in, because it historically has grown at about a rate of 7% per season. We are not in 7% per season territory right now with the new TV deals and Peacock and Netflix and this, that, the other thing. There has just been this massive surplus. Dan Graziano said it in his initial report. The cap will have increased by more than $53 million in the last 2 seasons combined. And some of that is spurred on by the only time there was a significant salary cap reduction was the COVID year when ticket sales were down, and revenue sharing as a result was negatively impacted out of that. So that's part of this, but it's not the big piece of this. So the challenge for Miami and the challenge for the league is knowing when the next CBA is up, which is at the end of this decade, and what that negotiation window is going to look like, what additional TV deal levers are going to be pulled in the meantime. The league's teasing an 18th game. That's the next kind of what feels like the next final frontier is an 18th game, because that's going to get everybody an additional, the other half of the league, an additional home game every year. Obviously, you're playing 18 games. That's going to mean more higher salaries for the teams. There's more ticket sales as a part of that. Yada, 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 etc. The dominoes are monumental. But the rate in which the cap is growing right now, let's take the lower number. And I'm not a math guy. I've admitted to being a self-admitted math guy, but I'm going to use the calculator here for this. But if you took 277 as the new cap floor, as the lowest band on the projections, and previously it was 255.4. It's about an 8.5%, 8.6% increase from last year. And historically, that number is 6.87%. What does that mean for next year? If that growth rate continues, right? If it continues growing at this new additional 33% higher growth rate than the historical standard of the salary cap, and let's say that checks in at 277 and a half is the lowest possible band. 185. You're talking about a 2026 salary cap that's exceeding $300 million. And right now, forecasts for that, I could tell you before this amended figure came in at 277.5, when I was working off 272, you were looking at about 290. So now you're talking an additional $10 million in cap space versus what forecasts were 2 months ago for 2026. And I think that's where it is important for this Dolphins football team to have some sense of discipline. It gives you more wiggle room. It gives you more options, but it also increases the temptation of holding on to an asset just a little bit longer. Let's hold on to this guy one more year. We could take the $30 million dead cap hit next year. We're getting an extra whatever. And while that is true, you need to pick and choose your spots. Because I can tell you, without touching the big four contracts that the Dolphins have right now, I can get you to $35, $36 million in cap space with basic restructures. Maybe one additional cut. That's plenty. And then if you do one of those big dominoes as a post-June 1st, that's another potential $18.5 million to sign your draft class with, to have an operating cap throughout the season, to be able to account for your practice squad, and then roll over what's left, kind of like the Dolphins did this past year. And then that whole process can start over. It's really interesting stuff, but it's also at times very complex stuff. But we should have some additional clarity, because I'd guess in the next week to 10 days, we're going to know what the final salary cap figure is. And then once that final salary cap figure is extended or is established, I think you'll see teams really start to push play. You've seen some movement, but this thing's really going to pick up here in the next week. So keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys as always for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'm Kyle Krabs, and I'm out of here. Go Fins.